Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining BCW today for a discussion on the election results, at least what we know thus far, and its impact on policy and brand expectations for 2021. I'm Dan Doherty, EVP and North American Practice Lead of BCW's Global Public Affairs and Crisis Practice, and I'll be moderating our discussion. The 2020 presidential election, of course, isn't quite over, and in fact, we're looking at potential news during our discussion today. Both Nevada and Georgia have scheduled press conferences, and while delays have been the name of the game so far, should those press conferences happen as scheduled, we'll fold those results and that news in real time to our discussion. But already the election's certainly been historic on many levels. The challenges of COVID-19, economic uncertainty, and civil unrest have created extraordinary dimensions, resulted in an unprecedented level of anxiety and ultimately voter participation. A record number of votes were cast. Vice President Biden receiving more votes than any candidate in history, and President Trump receiving more votes than any Republican candidate in history, and perhaps at the end of the day, the second most in history. The election has impacted all of us as individuals, professionals, and the companies we work for. Well, we don't know yet the results, so we'll start our discussion today with a look at the current state of play and past victories for both candidates. And then looking at the broader election picture, we can begin to lay out the landscape for 2021, which will have tremendous impact on companies and brands in both the short and the long terms. We'll spend some time breaking that down, providing some guidance for navigating the risks and opportunities that lie ahead. So let me introduce several of my BCW colleagues who are going to help us through this discussion. First is Chris Foster, President of BCW North America. Chris is responsible for managing growth, talent, and client relationships in the agency's largest region. He's an expert in pairing strategic counsel with integrated data-driven communications, and in fact wrote a book on that, so check out that book. He specializes in working with public and private sector companies on understanding the reputational risk and leveraging communications analytics to drive strategy. He's designed and implemented successful communication campaigns for Fortune 50 companies and some of the world's most recognizable brands. And he's also a veteran of several Democratic presidential campaigns. Next, I'd like to introduce Karen Hughes, BCW's Worldwide Vice Chair. As many of you know, Karen is a leading communication strategist. She specializes in strategic messaging, crisis communications, and executive communications. Her career has spanned public policy and government service, political campaigns, communications, and journalism. She served as counselor to the president for President George W. Bush. Many of you may remember her during the counts in Florida. In that campaign, and she also served as Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs at the State Department. And really notably, next month, Karen's going to be inducted into PR Week's Hall of Fame, so congratulations, Karen. Finally, Stefan Bailey, Managing Director at BCW's sister company, Prime Policy Group, our federal lobbying team. He spent 2 decades in Washington shaping the outcomes of consequential policy decisions and earning a strong reputation for using bipartisan collaboration and creative thinking to leverage meaningful results for clients. Prior to joining PPG, Stefan served nearly 10 years as a senior legislative staff member in the Senate and House of Representatives, where he developed a firm grasp of the intersection between policy and politics. He hails from the great state of Indiana and is a very proud Hoosier. We have a lot of ground to cover today, and before we begin, I just wanted to take a note of a few housekeeping items. We're going to keep our discussion to 35 minutes, so wrapping up around 12:30 to allow for some time at the end for questions. And we definitely want to get your questions. Feel free throughout the discussion to submit those questions using the chat function on the screen, and our team's going to collate those and get those to us at the end, and we'll get to as many as we can. So let's jump right in. Stefan, I'm gonna throw this out to you. We've had 48 hours of counting votes, and certainly some large pieces and many votes yet to be counted, and perhaps quite a bit of litigation as well. But we do know a lot already about some of these state results and as well as the congressional votes. Can you just give us, from your perspective after 48 hours, the overall state of play?
Sure, thanks, Dan, and thanks all of my colleagues allowing me the opportunity to be on here, and I look forward to the discussion. As I think as everybody knows, and as we've all been following, Joe Biden is poised to achieve the 270 electoral votes that he needs. That could happen as early as today, and Dan, as you alluded to, it could happen within the hour. So his path to achieving the 270 threshold, his paths have expanded since Election Day, while President Trump's have diminished. We're waiting for critical states like Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada. Biden is leading or strongly trending in Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. If he wins those, interestingly enough, he achieves 306 electoral votes, which is the same number that President Trump had in 2016. Lastly, cutting against this narrative of Biden's strength is the strong performance of down ballot Republicans across the country in the Senate, in the House, and at the state level, which importantly, which defied expectations and will have ramifications throughout this next decade.
Karen, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Dan, I'll pick up on that a little bit. Obviously the expected blue wave did not happen, at least when it came to the Senate and the House. In fact, one of the big surprises on election night, I think, was that Republicans actually gained seats in the House when they were expected to lose 15 or so. And so we won a lot of House seats. So Republicans in the House, while still a minority, are a much empowered, I think, an emboldened minority. And I think that it has weakened Speaker Pelosi and her leadership team. And so I think, the Senate, it appears, will at least be very close, and likely end up, maybe after a couple of runoffs in Georgia, as a Republican Senate. And so we'll have divided government. And that I think that reflects the country as a whole, which obviously in a record turnout is just very divided, which is not what the polls showed heading into this election. And that's created a lot of tension. I was just sharing with my colleagues before we started that this is all weighed heavier on me than I expected. And I think because it brings back memories of those long agonizing weeks of the Florida recount. We still have a very closely divided country. And I think that's something that companies need to be thinking about, particularly for their own employees, because whatever happens in the days ahead, you're going to have employees who are very distressed and who are anxious and who are very emotional on both sides. Either they're elated or they're dejected. And I think companies and brands have to be very sensitive to that in the days and weeks ahead.
Yeah, let me build on that, because Chris, this is something you talk a lot about, and is when we talk to our clients about, hugging your employees, right, and taking care of your employees first. Karen just talked about all that anxiety and certainly this, gray area of uncertainty where it seems like no one can think of anything else but that right now. What's your advice on how companies should treat this period of uncertainty as it relates to employees?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, Dan. I'd say two things. One, if all we were managing now as a country and as corporate leaders was an election, I think that'd be one thing. But you have to put into context, we're still dealing with the uncertainty of a pandemic, very much heading into a wave 2, regardless of what you may think politically. I mean, we are seeing incidents of coronavirus increasing. There's the financial implications around that. We're still managing a national dialogue on race equality, as well. So I think the to Karen's point, the heaviness, the weight of the moment can be overwhelming to a lot of people. And for some people, the election's really as much a statement on the social and moral consciousness of the country, which is why I feel like this feels unlike anything else. I'd say, look, I'd run to the staff. One of the things to your employees, one of the things we've learned over the past few months is the expectations have evolved a bit. Our employees want to hear from employers and leadership. They want to hear beyond just that which is at work. For some staff, we're a bit of a lifeline for information, for connectedness, for having conversations. The conversations we're not able to have at the water cooler, we're now having on Teams and Zooms and WebEx. So I think we have to sort of encourage that. I would encourage those business leaders to create the safe space for conversations to be had by employees, but also, focus employees on work and the job at hand, because we're all needing to move forward, regardless of where we are today. The sun's going to set at 6:18 Eastern. It's going to rise tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock roughly, and it'll be a new day. So we have to continue to move forward. And I do think there is a responsibility for business leaders to continue to help in the process of healing and moving forward.
And I think you hinted at, the personal investment that so many feel in this election. And I'm going to ask this for everybody because, since I can remember, since I've been old enough to remember, every election is historic. This is the big one. It feels like that every time. And certainly, there's been a much greater emphasis this time around that this truly is different than any other election. Given what you've been part of, given the elections you see, do you feel that way? And how do you contextualize that?
No, I 100% feel that way, Dan. I was having this conversation with my son on election night as we sort of created Election Central in our living room. I mean, this is as much of this is about the economy and trade and tariffs and the like. I mean, this is also, as I mentioned, there's a social recovery that has to happen as far as bringing a country together. And I think we need that. I think our children need that. I think all of us want that. We need to come together in some form or fashion. So for me, the weight of the moment, with the cloud of coronavirus, the cloud of the uncertainty of the next couple of months, just feels a little heavier. And I think we're all experiencing that. I think there's the comfort that we have is I'm not alone in feeling that gravity of that. I think we're all sort of feeling that now, and we're going to sort of manage through it together. So I think this one does feel different for me, for sure.
I'll agree with that. I mean, I always say every presidential election is really important because it has enormous ramifications, obviously, not only for our country, but for the world. And I felt like the campaigns that I was involved with, I remember at the time, they were the most important things that had ever happened. But I would agree that this one feels especially important. And I think it's because of the confluence of things that we've frankly experienced this year, unlike anything else. And one of the trends that I see coming out of the whole COVID situation for companies and their reputations is this growing intolerance of inequity. Mm-hmm. And I think that really impacted the election. I think it was heightened because of the George Floyd and other murders happening in the midst of a pandemic that already seemed to unfairly discriminate, right, based on race. And that really heightened this sense of intolerance of inequity, whether it be racial, economic, income inequality, food insecurity, and a whole host of those issues, which I call fairness issues, are being conflated. You're now hearing the environment talk about in terms that is used in environmental racism or discrimination. So these issues are being conflated, and they're very emotional issues that people feel very deeply. And so I think that was an overlay on this election that made it really unlike many others.
Hey, Karen, you make me think of something that's also a little different, Dan, and I'm here in Washington, D.C. We've seen a lot of advocacy, right, through protests and marches, one for solidarity, demanding change. Not having seen as much of that around presidential elections. We saw some of that in 2016, really in January 2017, but just also recognizing that we have electorate who will take to the streets, right, and also sort of talk about and protest and advocate on behalf of causes and issues they feel strongly about. That feels different to me. There's, it's Karen. I feel like there's a little bit of people want to be heard. And you want to have voice. And I think that's a good thing, largely, provided it's safe. But that's another dynamic that I think is quite different in this campaign. Not knowing exactly what the response will be and what the advocacy will be proceeding it, I think is going to be really interesting.
And companies are dealing with that too, with employee activism. I mean, when I was starting my career, young people coming into the workplace would never think of walking out of their own employer or staging protests or complaining about, businesses that the company was working with. And yet this rising generation, I mean, the millennials are moving into leadership. The Gen Zers behind them, they're much more diverse. They're much more activist. They're much more willing to speak their minds and to hold their employers accountable. Yeah. And so we're witnessing that. It started in the tech sector, but I think it has the potential to spread beyond that.
And we're seeing that already in terms of the contested election process, right? So, yeah. We saw last night, I think, demonstrations on both sides of count the vote, don't count the vote, count this vote, depending upon your perspective. And some of them, I couldn't even tell which side they were on, depending upon the state. So we've got to get through that. Hopefully, we can know in the next hour here, and some of this may be short-circuited. And relieve a lot of that pressure. But people feel strongly. They're willing to go out and activate around it. They're willing to put pressure on companies and brands and others to get involved and do the right thing, particularly being frustrated with government. But Stefan, now we're into this contested election process. What do you see here? How does that play out?
Yeah, well, sure. And to Chris and Karen's point, I mean, just look at the massive turnout that we saw throughout the country. That is people having their voice heard and going to the polls and taking advantage of that right that folks in America have. So, and that in part is leading to some of these challenges that election officials are having across the country, processing ballots, doing it on time, as quickly as they can, but doing it properly. As we all know, the Trump campaign has indicated it intends to request a recount in Wisconsin. It is pursuing remedies in other states, recounts, other challenges. That process and the recount rules vary by state. Most states have a threshold requirement that must be met, usually if the margin is equal to or less than 1%, in some cases a 0.5%, depending on the state. Wisconsin, for example, allows a candidate to request a recount if the margin is 1% or less. Coupled with that, so that process is going to unfold over a period of days, and we'll see, depending on what some of the outcomes are in terms of the final vote count, whether or not the Trump campaign and frankly the Biden campaign continue to pursue those. In terms of certification of these results, that's where we're getting really into the nitty gritty. These deadlines where state officials have to certify the final vote count begin next week and run through the end of the month, depending on the state. That also varies. So ultimately, federal statute dictates that all post-election challenges must be concluded by December 8th, which is in prelude to the electors of each state meeting in their state capitals on the 14th of December to formally vote for the presidential ticket. So there is a very kind of convoluted process, but it's established in law, and I think candidate campaigns have the ability to pursue these things, but they will be addressed at some point in the very near future.
Hey Dan,
Mm-hmm.
just one thing on that, because Stefan, you opened with the record number turnout and referenced how that is another indication and an example of how we know people want to be heard. From the standpoint of an employer and brands and organizations. I think, Karen, you alluded to that desire to feel heard conveys into the workplace. And I think we've done a good job of allowing that space over the last several months as we've managed through that. But I do think it's even more important now to allow for that space in the workplace to sort of bring the workforce together. Because just like we have a divided country largely, we'll have a divided workforce, and we have to lead everyone as business leaders. We can't just lead to the right or the left. I think that quite frankly, that dynamic, I think can create a real opportunity for business leaders moving forward to lead from the center and bring everyone together. But that notion of being heard, I'm sensing just in the last 72 hours for our employee base, they want to be heard, and I want to give them space to be heard.
Yeah, there's a tremendous sensitivity to that, and I think one thing this has been good for Amtrak and some airlines as the flood of lawyers have jumped on the trains and headed to Philly and other places to mobilize around this on both teams. But Karen, you saw that process first, the first real contested election, upfront and personal. What are your recollections on how you mobilize, how that plays out?
Just how I remember, as you say, calling all the lawyers we knew and getting them on planes to go to Florida in the middle of the night, before I was joking yesterday. One of the only things that gets you through an experience as traumatic as a presidential campaign is the knowledge that come election day, it's over. Win or lose, at least it's over, right? And then you cross the finish line and it's not the finish line. And somebody tells you, by the way, keep running this marathon and we'll let you know when you can stop. I do think what's really important is what happens at the end of the situation, right? So you have all the lawyers will do the maneuvers, and that's our system. That's part of our process, and that we want to ensure a fair process, and that's one of the reasons the courts exist, so that we can make sure that people's votes do count and are counted fairly. But at the end of the process, one of the things that I most recall is how important President Bush felt that it was to bring the country together after this very difficult experience. And so we very deliberately, and I would counsel whoever ends up winning, that they very deliberately work to reach out to the other side. So for example, we had him speak the night that the election finally was resolved from the Democrat House chamber in Texas. He was introduced by the Democrat Speaker of the Texas House. He talked about the lessons of history. We talked about the contested election of 1800 and how Thomas Jefferson, when he won that, talked about the steady character of our countrymen being a rock to which we could safely moor. And so he made a deliberate effort to say, I'm your president. If you voted for me or if you didn't vote for me, I'm still going to try to be your president. And so I think it's really important and certainly would hope that when this is all resolved, that a President Biden or a President Trump would seek to try to bring the country together.
So we didn't see the red wave, or some had even predicted a blue wave, but generally a red wave in Congress, Stefan. So the idea that there was going to be a real push from the progressive left on topics, stakeholder capitalism, et cetera, a lot of pressure through that. Now that it looks like the Republicans are gaining seats in the House, the Senate's still waiting to be figured out, but maybe 50-50, but likely tilting Republican. Where do you see that debate going and the push from the progressive left, and how that will impact the kind of topics that are going to be talked about on the Hill?
Yeah, Dan, great question. I think that there are synergies between a lot of the activism that we've seen this year, beginning earlier in the year and obviously running through the summer and up to the election. I see that there are synergies between some of those activists on the ground and the more progressive wing in the Democratic caucus in Congress. Progressives, particularly in the House, can amplify and have the opportunity to amplify the voices of those activists across the country, because there are many kind of pieces of connective tissue there, be it on social or environmental justice, fairness, and the like. Engagement with that progressive wing of the Democratic caucus is something that we counsel our clients on all the time, even more so this year, because I think sometimes that the progressives can be somewhat misunderstood, maybe overlooked in terms of do they need to hear what we are saying from a brand perspective or from a client perspective. So we work very hard to make sure to bring that to the fore.
Let me make a couple of points on that. I think because of the likelihood of divided government, that I think we're going to see a lot more, particularly if there is a President Biden, a lot more activism at the agencies on those sort of issues. So I think whereas President Trump has been deregulating, I think you'll see a lot of re-regulating, a lot of reinstatement of the Obama era regulations when it comes to consumer protections, labor, environmental regulations, OSHA regulations, Labor Relations Management Board. I think you'll see a lot more action at the agencies because of the difficulty, if there is a Republican Senate, of passing legislation. So I think you'll see quite a bit of that. And I also think that because one of the interesting things that I've been thinking about is we've seen this coming together of government, academia, private sector pharmaceutical companies to try to develop a COVID vaccine. And they've done, I saw a quote from one of the pharmaceutical CEOs saying they've done things in 6 months. It would have taken them 10 years prior to that. I can see a President Biden trying to appeal to the left of his party, doing the same type of initiative when it comes to another urgent issue of climate, and trying to pull those various aspects of business, government, academia together to try to develop quickly some innovative solutions on climate, because he'll be wanting to appeal to that, that side of his party for which that is really, in some cases, the most urgent issue. And so I think the implication for companies is that think about, what you can do in your own operations to have an impact on the environment, to try to, consumers are looking for that. We've seen surveys showing that consumers are willing to make purchasing choices based on a company's environmental responsibility, their sustainability commitments. Investors are increasingly looking for that. We're seeing a lot of movement of money, as Larry Fink predicted, into ESG investing. And so I think climate commitments are only going to become increasingly important, both to the Democratic Party, but also to consumers and investors in the years ahead.
Karen, I think your point, is really important, and one that I haven't seen in a while, but I would hope to see more of. It's the whole notion of public-private partnerships around these large, beyond the domestic policy agenda, which I know that I'd predict that there's certainly an expectation that private industry play a much more active role in supporting the next administration on the domestic policy agenda. But even some of the broader issues, as you mentioned, in the regulatory space, whether it's energy or healthcare, I would love to see more of that. And I do think the experience in the past few months, as it relates to how academia, private industry, government sort of came together in a manner I hadn't seen in a long time around the coronavirus vaccine. I would love to have that be a blueprint for how we move forward for other industries and other issues. We're going to need to move very quickly, very deliberately to stimulate the economy. It's not just the government. We can do we can do infrastructure and whatnot. We're going to need private industry to get behind that as well, to instill consumer confidence and create more jobs. So I think that's where my hope would be. The next administration would really lean in, and I would say for a lot of those on the webinar, as you're thinking about your businesses and the industries, being very proactive in reaching out and trying to partner with agencies and the government on that, because we need innovation, and I think the government's going to be very willing to receive that type of assistance and collaboration.
And Chris, the issues that we've seen for our clients growing and sort of that we knew were trending into next year, much of it has been accelerated by COVID-19, and we can talk about climate change just in and of itself, right? So the economic downturn and the gains that people have actually seen in terms of, we talk about the cleaner water in Venice, et cetera. People are spending more time outside, they're appreciating it more, and they want to realize those gains. So we've seen in our research that people are paying attention more. To your point, Karen, we already saw that consumers are making decisions that way, investors are making decisions that way. It's only accelerated, and next year is pretty significant. No matter who's president, and certainly Biden Biden president would focus more on some of the bilateral agreements. But we're going to have the UN climate change in November in Glasgow, and that's going to be presuming we have a vaccine, that will be the first in-person global meeting on this in quite some time. So there'll be a lot of build up to that, and a lot of pressure for brands and corporations to be on the mark.
Hey, Dan, one thing I think we also can't forget, you mentioned our first in-person meeting. I mean, we still have dare I say 70% of the economy on a remote work situation, right? So while we're trying to do this, I don't know that we're going to have in-person meetings or how Congress will convene and the like. So we have to make sure that we almost have to together try to reimagine how we do that in this remote environment, which we could presumably be in for the next 9 months or so, if I'm dare I speculate. So I think that's another dynamic that I think is quite important, but it could be an opportunity.
So as a corporation and a brand, as you look to sort of managing and evaluating the opportunities and risks from a public affairs perspective and from a government affairs perspective, you wake up this morning, you're in charge of that brand, you're in charge of that corporation. What are you thinking? What are the processes you're thinking of? How do you handle it?
I'm happy to start. I'm sure others have. Look, I think at the end of the day, what I do and what I've encouraged my clients to do is focus on my people first. Right? If I take care of my people, they'll take care of my customers. That I think is job one, because I just think that's the core of what we're doing, and we're very much in a people business. The second is a lot of us have planned for any scenario. We've planned for a lame duck Trump administration or for Biden. Dust those plans off, and I think now it's time to pull the action plans out. Right? We do know there's going to be a focus on alternative energy, infrastructure, coronavirus, the social recovery, healthcare. So if you're in those industries, now is the time to start to begin to think very strategically of how I use this transition period to align my organization and trying to get the right relationships together so that I'm ready to help inform policy and that agenda moving forward. So I would really focus on that. I would hope also, and my strategy will be, I want to move quickly out of this moment. I don't want us to sort of languish in the weight and the gravity of whatever the decision is. As far as the president-elect or the next term of Trump, I just don't think we can, just given the other factors we're managing as a nation, I just can't let this election be a movement. I need this to be a moment that we move past.
I'll just weigh in with a couple of points. One is I would say that as a company, you've got more stakeholders than ever with higher expectations than ever. And so you've got to really think through who are those stakeholders and what do they expect of you, and think through. There's more, as we've discussed, more pressure on companies and brands to speak out on social justice, racial issues. Think through the context, the content, the tone of your communications. It's really difficult because you've got to think about those stakeholders and think about the fact of how divided those stakeholders may be and what different points of view they may have. So the content and the tone of your communications, right, the timing of your communications have never been more important.
You're Karen, and you think about that globally as well, too, right? So you have stakeholders. We tend to think right now North America, but some of these stakeholders, when you're a global operation, have very different perspectives, sometimes adversarial perspectives when it comes to trade, technology, and these sorts of things. So really understanding sort of the ROI and going out on things and how you communicate the cadence of things and having a nimble campaign, it's really essential, one that can be flexible, and truly understanding in a really deep way the expectations of all your stakeholders. Is having a good analysis of those stakeholders to really navigate finding a way to thread that needle on some of these more complicated global challenges that companies have to talk about and CEOs have to go out about.
And for companies who have business in China, I think managing that, no matter who is president, that is going to be very difficult going forward, because I believe that there's been a shift in thinking in Washington. For 8 administrations after President Nixon, it was pretty much a policy of constructive engagement with China. I think now both parties see China as more of a competitive relationship. And so companies and brands are increasingly, I think, going to be under pressure to choose, just whose side are you on, particularly in industries that have national security implications.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartely, and Karen, you're exactly right. There has been a bipartisan consensus, I think, around addressing those issues, and so I know that all our clients and brands are focusing on that and trying to figure out how to kind of navigate that. But I think we're going to, and COVID, in fact, helped to accelerate some of these discussions around supply chain issues and so forth, which I think. The Biden administration, if there is one, will maybe have some of the same ends as the Trump administration, different tactics, however, maybe a little bit less unilateral, more bringing our allies together to kind of address some of these issues. But I think that's right, and that's an issue that's going to stay with us for a long time and potentially be one where there's some bipartisan consensus.
Stefan, building on that, let's lean in a little bit. Assuming electoral counts where they are now, let's lean in first on a Biden presidency real quick. What are the key areas, if it were a Biden presidency? What are those key areas of interest? Those healthcare, et cetera. Give us a flavor for what you would expect in the first 100 days and beyond from a Biden presidency.
Sure. Well, obviously, and he said this throughout the campaign, addressing, COVID is and the public health is number one. So they're going to put a massive effort behind that. And I anticipate that much of the transition, again, if there is one, will be focused on trying to figure out not only, logistics and things of that nature, but how to talk to the American people about it, how to bring them back, how to make it a less partisan issue around certain things, be it masks or whatever it is. So trying to understand that. Certainly bringing the economy back is going to be a big issue, and the COVID and the economic issues, I think, will dovetail into some kind of a large initiative that the administration and Congress work on very, very early. A couple of the other things that Biden will look to, and this certainly is not a partisan statement by any means, but repairing some of the frayed edges of our institutions and understanding how we can make some things work better. Every administration comes in, Karen, you can speak to this better, but tries to repair things that maybe the last administration let lag or let get stale or what have you. I think there will be a lot of thinking around those issues. And then it was alluded to earlier, resetting our relationships with allies and the global kind of a cohesive framework that has existed, since the Second World War, and has helped America keep a check on a lot of things, but work with our partners globally to address some of the biggest challenges that we have. As I alluded to before, COVID is a perfect example of that. For us to be able to reopen the economy globally, and certainly in the United States, we need to partner with our allies to figure out how to do it. Joe Biden formerly was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He has a lot of these relationships. He's vice president. So I think those will be just a few of the things that they focus on in the early part of the administration, and certainly during the transition.
He actually has published almost a laundry list of things that he'll do day one, and one of the first ones is he said he'd be on the phone to our NATO allies saying America's back. But I would expect him to rejoin the World Health Organization, to rejoin the Paris Accords. I do think I had the opportunity to work with him when he was chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I think he feels that American foreign policy is our alliances are extremely important, that it's a bipartisan matter, and I think he will approach it in that way, and it will be much more engaging with the world to do things like confront China, for example. He won't do a America alone approach. It'll be a much more multilateral approach with our allies.
So we talk often about that policy is ultimately starts with votes, right? You can't enact policy, you can't drive policy without getting the votes and getting that support and getting the offices you need to make that happen. So one of the first things I did, looking at when I realized that it was going to be a divided government and the Senate wasn't going to flip, is take a look at who's up in 22, and where who's going to be on the hot seat, those that won and by slight margins. And so as we look, because I'm already looking at what are the coalitions that are going to move the parties forward one way or another. Are there key takeaways when you look at the overall results? And we still have a long way to go to get through exit polls and really deep dive analysis and all of these things. But there are certain trends, Karen, you and I talked about, and for Republicans, the gains that they made, particularly with the women that were elected to office.
Yeah, I was fascinated that I think they had a very smart strategy of running some very great women candidates for the House. And so that gives me hope. I find that women tend to be pragmatic problem solvers. I've seen that during my time in government. It was often coalitions of women that would come together and try to work on things that seemed intractable. I was glad to see Susan Collins win in Maine. She always manages to defy the polls and pull through, and she's a very constructive, pragmatic problem solver in the Senate. I think there was we have to be able to appeal to more diverse voters as Republicans, and there was some of that in Florida that we saw, where Hispanic voters, Cuban Americans, voted more for Republicans. So I think we're still dissecting all the trends, but I believe the fact that there was a record turnout, and that we've elected more women, that we seem to expand our appeal among Hispanic voters are encouraging things on which to build going forward.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in, I'm not going to say anything incredibly novel here, but I think it's worth noting that our, despite all the consternation, the warning signs, the threats from abroad, from malicious actors, our institutions held up, and I think that's a testament to our society, our democracy. We saw that record turnout. The vote is still being counted, but people went to the polls and took advantage of that opportunity. And so we owe obviously a great deal of a debt of gratitude to the thousands of poll workers, election officials, the volunteers across the country who enabled this to go off. And I think that's important because, there was a lot of concern prior to the election about, how is this going to turn out? What's going to happen in our communities? Are foreign threats actually going to be realized? And I think we're all pleased to see that didn't happen.
Well, Stefan, I think that's a really good point, and not just around the last few months in the general election, but even think about the lessons learned from 16 and all the work that the intelligence industry had done and working in collaboration with states and counties just to make sure we were prepared for any, interference. So I do think voter integrity, was a focus, and I think we see the results. I'm actually quite pleased about that too.
I agree with that, and I have a suggestion for maybe a good government group or a group of companies who want to encourage something. I know the states run their elections, but I think it will be helpful to have a movement toward more consistency in how they run those elections. So, for example, it would be nice to have some consistency about when you started counting ballots, or when ballots had to be mailed. Do they have to arrive by election day, or can they arrive up to 7 days later? I think it would be helpful for the country, frankly, and for voters who are watching on TV last night as they see all these dedicated volunteers in rooms counting ballots, to have more consistency. I mean, we have a universal commercial code. We have uniform accounting standards. I think it would be a worthwhile cause for some group to take up the cause of let's try to get a little more consistency in how we vote across the country.
You know what, Karen, and you know why I think that's just brilliant, and even more so needed just given the early vote. I mean, this. Right. 100 million early voters, and everyone's experience was a little different. I mean, I voted and it literally took me 5 minutes. I have a cousin in Baltimore. It took her hours. So, just thinking about how we sort of systematically set up different satellite early voting locations to allow for more seamlessness, that I think could be something we'll start to see more of. And I think that's an opportunity, depending on state election law, for private industry to support that as well.
And there certainly seems to be bipartisan support emerging just in the discussions, because depending upon what state and your perspective, you're on other sides of those processes, both parties. So both are getting a little bit of taste of that right now, and that's a lot of the discussion. So maybe the time for a blue ribbon commission, Karen. So we're going to move to Q&A. And I think Kat is going to come on and read some of the questions that we've been receiving.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dan. We've got a lot of really great questions coming in. The first question for the panelists is, do we have any insight yet on members of potential Biden cabinet and key roles, for example, Secretary of Labor, Commerce, and whether there may be bipartisan members?
I guess I will take a crack at that. There are certainly lists floating around, if you will, third parties that are closely aligned with the Biden campaign have been circulating things. I think if you look at the campaign, a lot of those folks are professional campaign operatives. There are several who I think will play very important roles in a potential Biden White House. Ron Klain being one of them, a former chief of staff, a former chief counsel on the Senate Judiciary Committee when Joe Biden chaired that committee. He actually ran the Ebola response task force in the Obama White House 6 or 7 years ago. So he's somebody that's going to play a very important role. Another individual, former Biden chief of staff and former Senator Ted Kaufman from Delaware, will be somebody who's running the transition for Vice President Biden. Will also be a very influential advisor. There are a host of names floating out there. Some of them are current sitting senators and members of Congress. Some are those that Vice President Biden ran against in the primary that may have opportunity and will be offered a position to join the administration. I can't necessarily speak to Commerce per se, USTR. I think that will become a little bit more clear in I won't say days, but the next couple of weeks ahead. And I think we all of us on the video here will be pulling together those lists and that speculation for our clients. So would be happy to share that at that time.
Karen, do you want to? I was going to talk about the part two of the question, but you probably have more experience given what you and President Bush did.
I was just going to quickly say that I know we felt it was important that we had a Democrat as member of the cabinet. In our case, it was Norm Mineta as the Secretary of Transportation, former representative from California. We thought that was an important signal to send, to have some bipartisanship within the cabinet. And I presume that President Biden might think the same thing with one or two Republicans in a cabinet.
Agree.
Great, thank you. We have another question here specifically for you, Karen. Karen, from your Florida recount experience, can you take us a little bit deeper through the legal and public affairs strategy of the campaigns, especially with social media respect? What's going on inside those campaigns right now, and then also over the next few days and weeks?
Their heads are exploding. I think it's probably what's going on. From the legal perspective, we had lawyers fanned out across the state of Florida. We wanted to try to get them in as many polling places as possible to monitor what was happening, to watch. I had members of my public affairs staff also fanned out across the state of Florida. We had early morning phone calls every day with President Bush, with me, with my team in Florida. Margaret Tutwiler, a former President Bush administration official, went to Florida with James Baker, who was heading our legal effort. And so we were all on the phone literally every morning and every big development, sort of pulling together strategy on the fly because things were changing so fast. One day they'd be counting again, then they'd stop counting, then there'd be, there'd be a whole ballot box found somewhere else in some new county. We'd have to send people over there. And so it was funny. I was at the President Bush wanted me to stay here in Austin with him. And so I was at the campaign headquarters every day. So it was a little different from the campaign for me because the campaign, you traveled, you're in 3 or 4 states a day. And all of a sudden I was in one place, but I was completely, as the campaign spokesman, I was surrounded, literally I had a television camera follow me down the hall into the bathroom on the second day. And so I was on television a lot, just doing updates. We had our campaign chairman, Mark Roscoe, fly in to do updates for the television. One of the things we were thinking about was we felt that the President Bush had won the election. That when the votes were counted on election night, he had won Florida, and so we were trying to project. We were careful not to be presumptuous, right? So I remember on a personal level, you're also facing a lot of things because if we were going to move to Washington, I was going to have to sell my house so that I could, find someplace to live in Washington. I couldn't put my house on the market because the reporters would all report on that as being very presumptuous. And so we were trying to project a sense of confidence without being presumptuous. And I think that's probably what's going through Vice President Biden's mind right now is you notice he's been careful to say he thinks he's going to win, but he hasn't declared victory. Yep. Because he doesn't. I think that's probably top on their mind. They're trying to project the things that they feel it's inevitable that he will become the president, but not cross that line of looking as if he's being presumptuous.
Great, thank you, Karen. Dan, this one's a question for the broader panel here. How will you counsel your clients to think about a plan for a Biden administration and a policy agenda with a Republican-controlled Senate?
So run to the agencies. I think Karen said it best. I mean, I think if Biden does get the president-elect, I think he's going to have a very difficult time. With the Senate and Nancy Pelosi's going to have a tougher time. With the thin majority she has in the House. But I do think there's a lot of good work that that can be done just at the agency level. Candidly, just given Biden's policy agenda and what we think, as we were talking earlier, getting the right agency heads in place who are about change. He's got an aggressive agenda, and I would run right to the agencies, candidly, and I'd let the House and Senate get that sorted out. But I think it's going to take a minute over there.
Yeah, Chris, great point. I think the agencies, because there's going to be divided government and divided Congress, are going to have an enormous role to play. It's kind of the flip side of unified government had the Democrats, and again, they still may, but assuming that the Republicans keep the Senate, if you have a Democratic majority in the Senate, you know, that's where a lot of the action is going to take place, because you can get things done. And whether or not the filibuster would have gone, those are conversations for another time. But brands also and companies and interests also have a great, very good opportunity to help shape what Congress ultimately does, because they are constituents, right? And they have relationships with these members of Congress and can help shape outcomes, educate members of Congress about what is going on in their states, that then help kind of get you to the end product. Whereas with the Biden government, if there's more going on at the agencies, not that they're less accessible, but they're less accessible. You don't know them as well. They're not running for re-election in your state every 2 or 6 years. They're not back home all the time. So there are challenges and opportunities with both outcomes, but the agencies will do a lot where they can't find consensus in Congress. The other thing I would say is, I struggle with this myself. If Biden does become president, everybody just needs to create a new playbook in some respects regarding, the President Trump, such a unique influence and person kind of running the federal government. Everyone had to create a brand new playbook when he came into office. And I think Biden is going to be, much less out there on a day-to-day or hour-to-hour basis. The way that you approach the government is going to be different just by the necessity of having new people in. But there will be a number of ways where folks need to alter their playbook from a Trump administration to a Biden administration. I think culturally they'll just be totally different.
Yeah, and I would add to that, you talk about opportunity. There is tremendous risk and opportunity in the landscape ahead, right? So you have all of this pent up demand for change, for progress on some of these key issues. That's just simply not going to happen in a divided government. So even if Biden wins, the action isn't going to be seen, and there's going to be a tremendous amount of frustration. You couple that with, the increasing expectations on companies and brands to advance on those issues. It's a little bit of a squeeze, right? So there's going to be that frustration and they're going to expect more of companies and brands. So I think it really begins with truly having a deep understanding of your stakeholders and what they expect of you, and prioritizing those stakeholders, finding, where the risk is, mitigating that risk within those stakeholders. But there's going to be a lot of opportunity here, whether it be on these private-public partnerships around COVID, whether it be these sort of groups that, Karen, you talked about getting together, Biden, if it's Biden that he pulls together on climate change. There's going to be a lot of opportunity for CEOs to lead for their companies and their brands. So, but it does begin with, understanding what the ROI is vis-a-vis each of your stakeholders. And again, aligning that just not in North America, but globally, because these are global issues.
And Dan, I wouldn't forget also about working in collaboration, depending on your business. I think that's another avenue, depending on your business, where you can make some traction.
And I will add that Vice President Biden spent a lot of his career in the Senate. He's a deal maker, and I wouldn't discount the ability of a Vice President Biden and a leader McConnell to work together on some things. Now, you're not going to see corporate tax rates raised, I don't think. I don't think the Republican Senate would ever let that happen. But on some things like COVID recovery, you might see a more constructive working relationship between the White House and the leadership of the Senate in a Vice President Biden administration.
Yeah, and I'll just add one other change. If we have a Biden administration, for the last several years, Nancy Pelosi has been the de facto leader of the Democratic Party, at least insofar as the face and the one who is driving a lot of the policy. That too is going to change. So if Biden comes in, you're not only going to have a new administration, but she will be more taking cues from the White House than kind of running her own playbook. Now, she is her own brand, if you will. She's got her own power base. So I don't mean she's going away. I just mean that the House isn't going to be kind of the center of Democratic policymaking as it has been in the past. That requires people to change their approach to Washington.
I think the prospect, Karen, of what you just talked about, potentially some bipartisan measured, progress on some of these things is what the market's been responding to, right? Which is we're not going to see wholesale changes, and if we do get change, it's going to be a measured approach. So I think they're finding some satisfaction in that. I think we got time for one more question.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to shift focus a little bit to the brand perspective.
Okay.
Dan, you talked a little bit about increasing expectations of brands. So as brands right now, what are the things that you need to be doing and what are the things that you need to be avoiding?
So I think I mentioned it, is understanding your stakeholders first and foremost and the expectations of them and constantly checking on that. I mean, this is a very fluid environment. It is a divided country. Being close to employees, consumers, understanding what they expect of you, and then developing an appropriate sort of path that prioritizes those and recognizes an ROI of getting involved in certain issues that are right for your brand and your company. It is the time to avoid any untested approaches, gut reactions to getting out there and engaging on any issues. It really does require a comprehensive, integrated, well thought out approach that measures the risks and opportunities. And then I think also scenario planning, like continually to game out how this develops, because it does change pretty rapidly. Again, these are global issues for the most part that we're dealing with, and you have to be aligned with those changing dynamics across markets.
I think, Dan, the one add I'd have is, and I agree with everything you said, is as you're thinking about managing your workforce, I would try to avoid partisanship, candidly, depending on your business, because we know that we know we'll have 50% of your workforce in the country who will be happy with the election results and 50% who will be unhappy. But you have to lead everyone. So I do think trying to putting the hard work in leading a workforce that could in fact be quite divided, I think is going to be important as well moving forward.
And I would add putting your own house in order on two big areas. One is your environmental impact.
Yeah.
So really look at it. What are things you can do about it? That's not, the issue is only going to grow. What are things you can do to mitigate your own operations, the environmental impact of your own operations? The second big bucket I would say is diversity and inclusion. And again, it's looking at your own record. What are you doing to expand diversity in your workforce? What are you doing to promote more people of color and women? And what are your practices? I would think first about your actions as opposed to what you say. Put your own house in order, look at what you're doing. Those two areas are only going to grow in importance in the years ahead. And so get your house in order on those issues, and then you can think about what you want to say about them after you've figured out how you're going to act on them.
And to the extent you've made commitments, there were a lot of commitments and statements made earlier in the year on these issues, that you're making progress that you can report on when it comes up to that year mark, when everybody looks back and says, this is what you said, what did you do, how did you turn that into action and progress and meaningful change? That brings us to 1 o'clock. So appreciate everybody's time. This was a great discussion. Love the questions. We look forward to continuing to have these sort of discussions and webinars over the next couple months as we get the actual results and have a little bit more feeling on what the administration is going to be doing and what that looks like. How you Stefan, I know you were talking about the challenges of managing a transition and how you build relationships with a new administration. That's a challenge in and of itself, but also under COVID. So we're going to have some discussions and some guidance that come out over the next weeks and months. So thanks for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.